I'm really pleased now to offer the floor for an intervention to Pierre Tardieu from WindEurope, of course, which is a major association here in Europe. You should have been at their summer reception last week. It was one of the biggest and fantastic receptions I've been to. But in all respects, Pierre, the wind sector, it's fairly novel in Central Asia. It's very much a novelty. In Europe, it's not exactly a novelty, I would say. It's probably you can say becoming very much part of the mainstream, both in terms of energy supply and power generation. So if we can think in the context, if you can maybe kind of think out loud, what have been some of the highlights of the development of the wind sector in Europe? What have been some of the success stories? What have been some of the government incentives, let's say, that have facilitated this success? And what lessons might that offer us for Central Asia, for the development of the wind sector in Central Asia? Pierre Tardieu, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Marat, and very happy to be sharing a little bit the perspective of the wind sector here this morning. It's been really good to hear about sustainable hydro, to hear about solar, which obviously both have a phenomenal potential. On wind specifically, I wanted to start exactly how you framed it, Marat, that wind in Europe is no longer an alternative form of energy. It's really part of the mainstream. It's really part of the core of Europe's energy system today. So if you look at the EU 27 plus UK, wind is 17% of all the electricity that we consume. And in major economies, so in Spain, Germany, the UK, it's already more than a quarter. Not to mention, of course, Denmark, which is the global leader with 55% here. So what this means is that not only is wind energy at the core of Europe's climate action strategy, it's also at the core of our energy security strategy and our economic competitiveness strategy. Yeah, and you can see this. You don't need to take my word for it. The economic competitiveness point. Just look at the various energy sectors, various sectors of the economy across the boards that are now signing contracts directly with wind projects in order to secure energy at a very low and stable price. We even see major chemicals players such as BASF investing directly in generation assets, such as offshore wind farms in partnership, for example, with the big utility Vattenfall. So that's the first starting point. Here's where we are, essentially. Wind becoming mainstream and winds ultimately becoming basically half of all the electricity we consume down the line. So how did we get here? Would be the second question that you asked. I think it's important to do a little bit of history here. How did we get to an industry that employs 300,000 people across Europe, built state-of-the-art technology? Yeah, it took a lot of patience, a lot of work, and the right regulatory framework, which initially started with a combination of three things, I would say. Clear targets, right? So we started with a renewable electricity directive and then a major renewable energy directive, which said, look, by 2020, the EU needs 20% of renewable energy in its system. And if you drill down to electricity, you need a much higher share because it's much easier to decarbonize electricity than other bits of the energy system. So that was the first thing, targets, which then drove clear national plans, auction schedules, etc. First element. Second element, of course, giving a clear investment signal, and that in the first instance came in the form of a feed-in tariff. Very clear, stable. You produce wind power, you connect to the grid, you will get, say, 100 euros per megawatt hour that you produce. And then, of course, the third point, which went along with that, was priority injection into the grid, so priority dispatch. We've now moved much further down the line in a completely different environment where wind really stands on its own 2 feet. There are merchant investments in Northern Europe, so with no subsidies whatsoever. In Sweden, in Finland, merchant investments in offshore wind in the Netherlands. And what has really driven this has been technology developments, and efforts in terms of system integration. So developing the grid, becoming more mature at integrating renewables into the system. All of which means that now wind is essentially, with solar, the most competitive form of power generation. So much, much cheaper in Europe than other forms of energy. Yeah. So what can be drawn from this in terms of developing a policy for renewables in Central Asia and attracting investments? I think again here there are three things stemming from the from the lessons that we've learned here in Europe. One, I would say, is give a clear direction of travel, set the targets, set the regulatory framework, and make sure that investors know exactly what to expect. There's a rule in the EU whereby national governments have to set an auction schedule of 3 to 5 years in advance, and that has proven extremely effective at driving the investments and making sure that the supply chain is in place. The second, and this is one area where we're still, still need to make progress in Europe, is to sort out all the permitting, the administrative processes that come along with renewables projects. And here, maybe Central Asia can a little bit leapfrog all the problems that the EU has had. And the main driver for that is really digitalization, making sure that these processes are automated, that they're transparent, that they're clear, that governments, stakeholders, and investors know exactly where they stand in the queue, in the processes, et cetera. And finally, and I think I'd like to come back to a point that you were making a little bit earlier, which is all about grids, grid planning. We know in Europe that in fact, 40% of our grid is 40 years or older, so we need to continue constantly making investments in the grid. And I think this is something that is relevant worldwide, and certainly for Central Asia. Interconnecting is something that is extremely important and potent when it comes to integrating variable renewables. And the key here, I think, when planning ahead, is really to make the anticipatory investments to basically plan jointly renewables development and grid development. And that really creates the necessary framework to really leverage the potential of renewables, which are, of course, good for the climate, but they're also good for energy security and ultimately for economic competitiveness.